A very good afternoon to our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Abigail Chang and I'm a fourth year English Literature major from the School of Humanities. Now it's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Before we begin the dialogue with President Janet Napolitano of the University of California, may I introduce the chair of today's session, Professor Ellen Chan, NTU's Coordinating Vice President for the NTU Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, or NISTH for short. Let us now put our hands together to welcome on stage Professor Ellen Chan.
Thank you very much, Abigail. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the special edition of the NTU Dialogue Series, a dialogue with President Janet Napolitano, President of the University of California. We are, I think, truly privileged and honored to have Janet with us this afternoon. I didn't realize that this is her first visit to Singapore and NTU, and we are grateful that Janet and her colleagues have chosen to visit NTU. I don't think I need to belabor the introduction. I think most of you will know that President Napolitano is a distinguished member of the public service in the USA. Prior to her appointment as President of the University of California, I think you all know that the UC system is a complex and huge organization comprising not only the 10 UC campuses, but also the medical centers and other institutes and national level laboratories. I really don't know how one person can manage a community of over 250,000 members. And before her appointment as president of the University of California system, as I believe all of you would know, President Napolitano served as the secretary for the Department of Homeland Security in the US administration. And prior to that, she served 2 terms as governor of the state of Arizona. I'm also happy to note, as a student of philosophy, that President Napolitano also shares an interest in philosophy and has been quite recently inducted into the American Philosophical Association. She did her first degree in political science before she went into law school, and she also was a faculty member at the School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley. I shouldn't really be taking up the time here. Let me simply now invite our distinguished guest, President Janet Napolitano, to share her thoughts with us. Please. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor, and thank you all for that warm welcome. It is really a pleasure to be in Singapore this week and here at NTU this evening. I'd like to begin tonight by talking about the distinction between 2 words, the word international and the word global. Existing, constituted, or carried on between nations, or pertaining to the relations between nations. That's the word international. The word global, on the other hand, means this: of or relating to the whole world, or worldwide. These differences become very relevant when you consider the following. Back in the 1960s, the thinker and polymath Stuart Brand began lobbying the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, to publicly release photographs of what he called the whole Earth. Brand believed that seeing an image of the Earth from space would, quote, change a lot of things. He felt it would be motivating for people because, quote, it gave the sense that the Earth is an island surrounded by a lot of inhospitable space. Here was his point. Unless and until we find other flourishing planets, he said, this is all we've got. And we've got to make it work. There is no backup. Brand's words underscore a fundamental truth about the world in which we live. When we see an image of the Earth from outer space, we do not see national borders. We do not see nations. In fact, when we see the Earth from space, we render the word international obsolete. What we see instead is one perfectly unified globe. We see global weather patterns. We see continents that stretch far longer, far broader than the individual countries that populate them. We see the only planet we've got, and we recognize that there is no backup. Now, well into the 21st century, Brand's point not only holds up, it grows even more imperative. The world our students, you students, will lead is one that will be more closely integrated, more seamless than the one we inhabit today. The reason we build these bridges is to give students a pathway to the experiences and resources they will need to lead that world wisely, effectively, and with compassion born of empathy. And in a world faced with grave challenges, universities have an obligation, indeed a moral obligation, to act as leaders in the midst of chaos and division. Problems such as climate change, perhaps the greatest challenge of our time, go beyond any one nation or region of the planet. They are indeed global, and solving them will require ambitious ideas, bold action, and a global approach. For my years in Washington as Secretary of Homeland Security under President Obama, had to mention that part, to my service now as President of the University of California, issues of both international and global scope have long been on my mind. Those who work on security and immigration issues, as I did as a cabinet secretary, tend to focus on borders and how the issues that surround borders can best be managed. These are international issues in the truest sense of the word. They pertain to the relations between countries. Those who work at universities, meanwhile, are focused on the whole. The word university, after all, derives from the Latin word for the whole, the entire number, the universe. The earliest universities in the West were national associations of foreign students attending law schools at Bologna, Italy in the 12th century. In the late medieval universities, student bodies were divided into nations, groups of teachers and students who had joined together from different places to seek and to create knowledge. In this way, universities provide a home for diverse people and ideas. They bring humanity together, sometimes in the most dire circumstances. During the Holocaust and World War II, for example, the New School in New York set up the University in Exile to provide an institutional home for brilliant European theorists who became refugees. You see, universities are not in the business of enforcing borders. We are in the business of building bridges. These bridges are not international in nature, They are global in nature. They are bridges built between individuals, students, faculty, members of the public. They are the bridges created between basic research and applied research. And they are the bridges formed between universities and the communities they serve. At the University of California, this manifests itself in the bridges UC has helped build between its students and their counterparts around the world. Since 1962, more than 100,000 UC students have spent part of their college careers studying and interning outside of the United States. And over the past 2 decades, more than 150,000 international students from 204 nations have studied at the University of California. Today, the University of California maintains study abroad partnerships with more than 115 institutions in 43 countries, and we are actively working to expand to other partnerships. That engagement with the world does not end when UC students receive their diplomas, by the way. More than 11,000 UC alumni have served as Peace Corps volunteers around the world since that program was founded, far more than any other university system in the United States. Meanwhile, UC researchers and their counterparts around the world, including here at NTU, are working together across borders in pursuit of new knowledge. Scholars at UC work with colleagues at institutions in Singapore to publish more than 2,600 research papers in the past 5 years in fields ranging from medicine to biochemistry to engineering. And that is in part why I'm here in Singapore this week, to build new roads for partnership in research and in education. The stakes are high, whether it is destructive wildfires in California or the impact of rising sea levels here in Singapore. The looming crises affecting the planet will require our best minds to transcend man-made barriers and work together. It will take a global approach to solve these grand challenges, and the challenges are formidable. Last year, for example, the Royal Statistical Society selected a sobering data point as its statistic of the year. I didn't know there was such a thing as a statistic of the year, but there is. The statistic highlighted the fact that out of the more than 8 billion metric tons of plastic waste ever produced on this planet, 91% has never been recycled. That number was calculated by UC Santa Barbara marine scientist Roland Geyer, and the chancellor of UC Santa Barbara, Henry Yang, is with me here this evening. The implications of this are troubling. The World Economic Forum estimates that by the middle of this century, the ocean will contain more plastic waste by weight than it does fish. More plastic waste by weight than it does fish. Meanwhile, despite the fact that we live in a digital age, global paper consumption has quadrupled over the past 50 years. 5 years ago, global paper production hit 400 million tons per year for the first time ever. Plastic waste, use of paper. But in spite of these daunting trends, there's hope. Universities are playing a key role in the cultivation of that hope by taking a global approach to innovative solutions. Chemists at the University of California at Irvine have worked together with colleagues at the Shanghai Institute of Organic Chemistry in China to devise a way to dissolve the strong bonds of polyethylene plastic. One day, this may allow us to recycle the millions of tons of plastic garbage currently in our oceans into liquid fuel. And in his lab at the University of California at Riverside, chemist Yadong Yin and his research team have developed rewritable paper. Yin, who specializes in the synthesis of nanomaterials, invented a new type of coating for paper that can be printed on with light and reused more than 80 times. His team also got particles of iron oxide, also known as rust, to gradually change from one color to another, similar to adjusting the color of a TV image. Possible applications for these new materials are varied and they're very exciting. Yin says his renewable paper is simple to make, has low production costs, low toxicity, and low energy consumption. In other words, for the first time since paper was invented in China around 100 BC, a new breakthrough may meet global needs for paper in a sustainable way. In his spare time outside of the lab, Yin has watched the BBC documentary series entitled Planet Earth. And when presented with this big picture perspective on Earth, Yin was struck by the beauty of the natural world and the precious nature of our only planetary home. He said, "I feel lucky to live on this planet. We need to change the way we do things today to ensure that we save our planet." These types of international collaborations have become ever more accessible thanks to the dawn of new technologies. And some of the most exciting discoveries humans have made recently are the result of international partnerships, including an observation that has dramatic implications for our understanding of the universe and how it came to be. For the first time in human history, in 2017, scientists observed two neutron stars colliding, a phenomenon known as a kilonova. What they saw was the aftermath of two collapsed stars that slammed into each other in a galaxy 130 million light years away. It was the first cosmic event in history to be witnessed by scientists using both traditional telescopes as well as gravitational wave detectors. And while it was a team from the University of California at Santa Cruz that took the first pictures of this kilonova, thousands of researchers working at more than 70 laboratories and telescopes on every continent were involved in detecting this collision. As they studied the explosion, astronomers found that it had produced more gold and platinum than the entire weight of the Earth. This was a stunning breakthrough that ushered in a new era of astronomy. It also confirmed one of the predictions of Albert Einstein, that gravitational waves move at light speed. Ultimately, the paper the astronomers published on this collaboration listed about 3,500 authors from around the world. That reflects the global approach we must take in studying the universe in the 21st century and beyond. As one astronomer told the Washington Post, "From this point onward, the more we want to know, the more we need to work together." That philosophy applies to fields beyond astronomy and is keenly relevant to the grand challenges our world is staring down. We must be bold and show moral courage in the face of ignorance, greed, obfuscation, and environmental crisis. We have to work together. And we've known for some time that that's the only way to get important things done. In 1962, President John Kennedy gave a speech at Independence Hall in Pennsylvania. This is where early American leaders debated the independence of what would later become the United States. In his speech, President Kennedy declared a new era of interdependence in the world. He vowed to, quote, "join other men and nations in preserving both peace and freedom, and to regard any threat to the peace or freedom of one as a threat to the peace and freedom of all." Words to live by. Today, we find ourselves in a new, ever more urgent phase of that era of interdependence. We are on the precipice of major global threats to security, to peace, and to prosperity. Now more than ever, universities must continue to serve as linchpins in global cooperation, the exchange of knowledge, and the harnessing of innovation. We all have a part to play in that work. Together, we can advance knowledge to serve humanity and protect the only planet that we've got. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Napolitano, for that inspiring speech and the importance of being global as well as having to protect our planet. Without further ado, may I now invite President Napolitano to take a seat at the front and also invite back to the front Professor Chan for today's dialogue. Now, the questions for today's dialogue have been submitted by our audiences here today, so a huge thank you to our audiences for submitting your questions, and the questions will be flashed on the screen later during the dialogue. So without further ado, Professor Chan, take it away.
Thank you very much, Abigail. We did receive some questions ahead of time, but perhaps I can exercise my privilege as chair, hopefully not abuse my privilege as chair, to raise the first question. In your view, President Napolitano, what is the future of education? You mentioned about the importance of being global, but we are also living in a time when the world is facing tremendous technological transformation. We've been told that many of the jobs, perhaps up to 60% of the jobs that we are familiar with today, may disappear in the near future. So as educators, what do we need to do in order to prepare our students for a very different tomorrow?
Well, I think, Professor, first of all, as my comments indicated, I very much believe that institutions of higher education have an obligation to make sure that the students they are educating are ready for a globalized world and are thinking beyond national boundaries to extant issues. I mentioned climate change in my remarks because I actually feel that from a variety of perspectives, that is the most critical issue facing the world. And it will require scientists of all kinds, hard sciences, social scientists, and an appreciation of the global nature of the challenge for us to really get at it. I think we need to educate students to be creative, to be resilient, to be lifelong learners. I think the notion that your education ends when you graduate with your undergraduate degree is out of date. And that we also need our public policy to support lifelong learning as it does here in Singapore. And there is so much that we need to do and can do, but it begins with the understanding that we cannot retreat into our shells and just be, NTU or the University of California, that we are much stronger and better educators working across those borders.
Thank you. The floor is now open. I invite your comments and questions. Actually, I've been asked to raise another issue, and that is how should universities further break down any barriers, especially for women in STEM fields?
So I think we need to think about why aren't more women going into STEM in the first place? And how are we educating, say, engineers? And we have this problem in the United States as well. We have this problem at the University of California. And in my view, we need to be rethinking the pedagogy. What is the STEM education for? What problems is it designed to address? What are the kind of the human elements that go into say, solving an engineering problem and so forth, and really try to make it a more, if I can use the word, attractive field to women students.
Are we ready to show some of the questions that we've received earlier?
This is anonymous.
Okay. In what ways do you think we can customize education in non-US regions such that we can learn from the US education system while avoiding or merely copying it? That's I think I know what this question is trying to get at. We talk about global education, but what actually does global mean other than having people from different regions or areas coming together? Can we begin to think about an education system itself that is global, whether in terms of curriculum or in terms of approaches to learning?
That's really an interesting question, because you could think of perhaps creating some kind of global climate university or global institute on global institute on food insecurity, global institute on water, global institute on sustainable practices, have that kind of a convening. It could be a virtual convening. It doesn't have to be a physical brick and mortar kind of place, but a way to tangibly recognize the global aspect of what universities are engaged and should be engaged in. In the meantime, I think encouraging more faculty, more students to exchange, more to come from the University of California to Singapore, and vice versa, as a way to think more comprehensively and internationally about issues that we face together.
I think the audience would be pleased to know that tomorrow the University of California and NTU will be entering into a memorandum of understanding precisely to try to find ways to promote academic exchange, including student and faculty exchange. Questions from the floor? I would especially like to encourage our students to raise whatever questions you may have. Oh, okay, here we are. For UCLA, the most popular majors currently are psychology and so on. What new majors do you foresee will spring up? Oh, that is interesting.
Well, I'll tell you,
I can read them there. Sorry.
There's new majors that are springing up all the time. So, for example, data science. 5 years ago, UC Berkeley had its first data science class, and it had maybe 100 students. Today, that class has 1,500 and a waiting list. Classes will go where new fields are developing, where there is a possible market, and where student interests are. And so far be it for me to say what's going to be the next data science, but I'm very confident there will be one or two or three.
Then we can probably see what else we have here. This is probably similar to the question we discussed earlier, but are there other advice that you would share with colleagues who may face still discrimination, glass ceiling?
So, I think just by virtue of the era in which I've spent my professional life, I've been the first female at a lot of different things, like the first female Attorney General of Arizona, the first female Secretary of Homeland Security, the first female president of the University of California. In each of those roles, you stand on the shoulders of those who have come before. But particularly in the United States, in the world of being a prosecutor or being involved in national security, that's very much a man's world still. I just think. When I became the chief federal prosecutor in Arizona, I used to have these meetings with all of the heads of the federal law enforcement agencies around the table, the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the INS, the IRS, et cetera. And they were all men, and I was the only woman, but I was chairing the meeting. Well, so, but I think, kind of humor aside, I think it's important to establish your credibility, that you have listened, that you've paid attention, that you have ideas, and you have a vision for what you want to achieve, and then persuade others to go along with you. But I think you have to establish that credibility first.
Thank you. Here's the next question, which seems relatively specific. Enterprise risk? Oh, okay. Wait, I can't read so fast. Would you care to comment a little bit about how the University of California system manages major risks?
Right. So organizationally, we manage risks within the office of the president. We think of risks in different ways. There's physical risk. For example, what if there were to be a major earthquake in California? Are we prepared? What if there were to be a major cybersecurity breach at the University of California? Would we know how to deal with it? Are we properly insured about risk? Have we taken into account kind of the financial reserves that we need to have? Have we taken into account prevention and training and other things that would fall within the category of risk mitigation? That's actually one of the major roles within the Office of the President, is to make sure this gigantic institution, which is 10 campuses and 5 academic medical centers and 3 national laboratories, can deal with risks of all type, and in particular deal with catastrophic risk should something materialize.
We have 2 questions from the floor. Oh, now you have warmed up. Can I first turn to Professor Kalstedt-Duke?
My question is specifically related to medicine. Jan Kalstedt-Duke. I'm in medicine, and although my question is specifically related to medicine, I think it illustrates one of the biggest challenges we have today, and it'd be very interesting to hear your perspective on this, and that is how can universities today actually prepare the students for tomorrow? So in medicine, we have a situation in which there are dramatic changes in medicine. We don't actually know how we're going to be able to treat patients in the future. We know a lot about what we're doing today, but the medical curriculum we have today is based on a strategy developed in 1910 by Flexner. We still have the same basic structure. We have an incredible increase in medical knowledge, and the doubling time is decreasing all the time. The doubling time today of medical knowledge is 73 days. How can we prepare students, and I think this is true for many areas today.
Yeah, indeed.
How can we prepare students for a future where we don't really know how we're going to cope with the major problems we have, and just being deluged with knowledge that we don't understand ourselves?
Well, that's a simple question. Look, medicine, like many fields, the pace of change. It's not just the fact of change, but it's the pace of change that has become so much more rapid. And so, I think it requires educators to step back and say, all right, well, what are the basic things that, say, a new physician, what does a physician need to know? So I think a physician needs to know about anatomy. I think that's kind of a basic. All right, so how do we teach about anatomy? Are we teaching it the same way that we did throughout the 20th century and the early 21st century? Are there different means of pedagogy that would make our teaching of the curricula more effective? And by more effective, I mean the students are learning, and perhaps they're learning actually more material within a certain period of time. So, I think it's both a step back and kind of a look forward. And I do think that young people today learn differently than young people who were raised, say, in my generation. And my generation wasn't that long ago. But it was before Google and Facebook, and it was before the internet. And so I think that, there's actually literature on this, that young people today, the neural passages in their brains are actually wired differently because they've been online since they were, 1 year old. All right, so how do we take that into account in terms of how we're teaching, how we're imparting knowledge to the students? And are we doing it in the most effective way possible for how they learn, not how we learn?
It's the UC planning to use AI in a big way in teaching and learning?
Yeah. I think at the University of California, there are a lot of different pedagogies that are being used and experimented with today. And, I think that we'll continue to see that.
Gentleman in the green shirt?
Hi, this is somewhat of a political question, and I apologize for that. So in situations such as this, as speaking as a UC president, it's quite natural, it seems, to appeal to international and global causes. But as somebody who, was a politician before, it seems to me, maybe you could comment on, if you were addressing voters, right, would you also kind of try to appeal similarly to international benefits and global benefits? Because
Yes,
often,
I would.
yeah, okay.
Yeah. So if I were in electoral politics today, I would make the argument that the United States is a country that thrives on international and with international engagement. And that people in the United States, that their lives will be better because of international engagement. And that the notion that as a country we can retreat like a tortoise in a shell from the rest of the world doesn't marry with the reality that we have, nor the future that we should have. So I make that argument as a university president. Of course, as a university president, it's easy to make the argument. Universities they're used to all of this. But I think the American people are being underjudged by some of their political leadership today. There we go.
Would you care to elaborate?
Yeah.
Professor K.K. Luke?
Thank you. Alan mentioned in his introduction some of your achievements as a philosopher. So my question, I'm K.K. Luke from the humanities. So my question is, do you think that philosophy will continue to be relevant in future in this rapidly changing world? And can you share with us that part of your life where you live and work as a philosopher?
Well, thank you. And yes, I believe philosophy and the humanities generally will remain important and actually critical because with the humanities, you are learning to think about larger life questions. You're learning to put things into historic and cultural context. You're learning about things like beauty in the arts or in music. And I think that we are educating young people not to be automatons, but to be equipped to live what one would call a well-lived life. And I think that absolutely requires a foundation in the humanities and in philosophy. I have been elected to the American Philosophical Society. I've not published anything in philosophy, but I sure think I talk a lot about it.
Professor Saeed first, and then you're next.
My name is Saeed. I am from sociology here at NTU. First of all, thank you so much for your very precise yet very powerful speech. My question is, what I gather from your speech is that universities are supposed to be very global, solving the global problems, transcending national borders and so on and so forth. But most of the universities are largely working within the political kind of structure or framework or apparatus that are largely focusing on the local issues, sometimes international issues, focusing on, for example, building walls, going for war, that are perhaps advantageous for some group of people, but very destructive to others. So my question is, how can the universities work solving the global problems, while working in this narrow kind of political structure? That's a tremendous challenge, I think, but how can universities, go beyond that?
So I think your question may contain a false choice. I think great universities do both. So I think, for example, the University of California has a role to play with improving the lives in the cities and within the state of California, improving the economy of the state of California, et cetera. And it also has a role to play on addressing some of these grand global challenges, to use that phrase. So I don't want to get caught in the either or. I think it's a both.
Please, next question.
Hi, so my name is Andrew. I'm a business exchange student from Queen's University, Canada, here at NTU. Thank you very much, Ms. Napolitano, for your speech. I have a question regarding, I think it follows on nicely to the last one, regarding like modernization of society, viewpoints, and changing cultural attitudes. So we've seen, I think basically forever, there's a difference between nations and large groups of people, but now there are becoming these asynchronous divisions inside nations, inside groups of people that didn't used to exist before. They're becoming worse. For example, the difference between people in the big international cities such as London, Singapore, New York versus maybe more rural Kentucky, whatever. These are the same nations, they're part of the same global society, but they're really not developing in the same way. And some of the technologies that we've seen in the last few years, they were supposed to make these problems better, but they've either not changed or they've even made them worse in some cases. So I want to pick your mind if you're doing anything at U of California, or if you have any thoughts about how you encourage your students or university students around the world to go out and engage with all these communities that might be more isolated, more forgotten, because it is, the global university trend is helping still the few, the people who go to U of California and then they go to Silicon Valley and they take their views with them there. It's not bringing it and diffusing it around the world still as much as it needs to. So how do you encourage your students to do that?
So I think that's a really difficult question, and one of the things that has worried me about what's happening in the United States, for example, is divides. So there is a divide based on income and income inequality that has only been growing. And then there is, as your question notes, there's this divide between those who live in cities where there are more people from other countries who live there, and there's more exposure to say the world, for example, versus rural America. And I actually think that if we're talking about a grand challenge facing the United States, I think that captures a grand challenge facing the United States. And it spills over into our electoral politics, and it spills over into what our students do, where they're attracted to live, et cetera. And so I don't have a good answer to that question, only to identify it as something that requires greater minds than mine to ponder. But you are so right that and this is it's actually within the United States, but it's also a global phenomenon. That those who live on the coasts, who live in the big cities, who live in locales where there are major universities, have increasingly a different worldview than those who do not. So how do we bridge that divide? Yeah.
Let's take a question from this side. Is Canada really building a wall between Canada and the US? Sorry. Please.
Thank you. My name is Ye. I'm a research fellow in mechanical engineering. I'm curious, so as to a question to the president of the prestigious public university in the US, my question is, how do you think the pros and cons between the private university and the public university, how are you going to cooperate or compete? And what do you think is your role as the president of the UC system to lead this huge ship moving forward to be becoming more prestigious and compete, or cooperate with like your friends, Stanford or Ivy League schools? Thank you.
So I think, one of the reasons I came to the University of California is because it is a public university. And by public, that means it has an emphasis on access and affordability as well as on excellence. And also attracted by doing what we do at the scale with which we do it. We have great partnerships with schools like Stanford or MIT or Harvard, et cetera. But the point of fact is that they educate a small fraction of the students that we educate at the University of California. And because of that scale as a public university, it allows us to do some things. For example, we have around 215,000 undergraduates. 42% are the first in their families to go to college. There's no public institution around or association of private institutions, around that can match that. Almost 60% of our in-state students come from families that make less than $50,000 a year. So the University of California, they're first in their families, they may be from a lower socioeconomic bracket, and they have the world of this grand international public research university as their oyster. And they can come, they can pick a major, they can change their major. They can go study abroad. They can do an internship in Silicon Valley or in Hollywood, or at the Scripps Oceanography Institute. I mean, they have all of these things that are open to them. And I think that I mentioned income inequality before. The one tried and true tactic in United States history that has helped address income inequality has been the role of public higher education. Because students who go to university do so much better with their lifelong learnings. So I think that there is a role for both private and public institutions in higher education. We have both kinds in the United States. Both are very robust segments, but the role of public universities is a very special one.
We have time for, thank you. We have time for just one final question, please. Welcome.
Okay, my name is Jørgen Slund. I'm in food science, the most important science, of course, but we're still very small here. But it's a more global question, and maybe it follows from this other one, because we see more and more all over the world that universities are getting money from industry, and a bigger fraction of the total money that are used in universities are now from industry, I think, in most countries. Do you see danger in that? Is there a danger in losing some of the independence that normally we should have so that we can help society in objective ways?
Indeed. So I think that the way to guard against that is to have very clear university policies on conflict of interest, conflict of commitment, disclosure of financial relationships, and to really go at it that way. Because I know we call it sponsored research. We have quite a bit of it, but we have it under the proviso that the research itself is independent and is not to be influenced by where the dollars come from. And the way we guard against it, and this is the faculty has to guard itself in a way. This is the faculty protecting the integrity and institution of the faculty. But that's the way we have to deal with it, in my view.
I wish we had more time, but I'm afraid I have to call the dialogue to a close. Please join me once again in thanking President Napolitano for sharing her insight with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
A huge thank you to President Napolitano and Professor Chan for the engaging and interesting dialogue. May I now invite you to take your seats. With that, we have now come to the end of the dialogue with President Janet Napolitano of the University of California. We hope that you have enjoyed the dialogue, and we believe that today is but the start of many conversations on the impact of education and science and technology on so many aspects of our daily lives. With that, I'm Abigail. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful evening ahead.